we've got a packed schedule, so I am going to get started. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us today. Welcome to Culture Shift's LGBTQ+ webinar called How to Deal with Anti-LGBTQ+ Misconduct in the Workplace, a discussion forum. Today's event coincides with Trans Day of Visibility, and we are delighted to be celebrating and continuing our support for our trans team members and the trans community around the world. Today we'll be discussing and sharing best practices on how to prevent and deal with bullying, discrimination and harassment of LGBTQ+ employees in your workplace, and how to make them feel safe, included and heard. For those who are new to Culture Shift and our online events, Culture Shift are a tech for good organisation who believe in a future world of work and study that is safe, happy and supportive for everyone everywhere. I'm Gemma McCall and I'm CEO and co-founder of Culture Shift. Our software and services empower organisations to tackle harassment and bullying of all kinds, allowing leaders to activate positive change within their organisations and maintain the culture that they want. Our software currently helps over 80 organisations, protects over 1.6 million people, transforming the way they listen to their people, foster the sense of belonging that we all desire, and actively identify, track, address and prevent incidents of harassment and bullying. And over the last 5 years, no customer has ever left us, which is a track record that I, as the co-founder, am hugely proud of. I'm delighted today to be joined by Ed Cox, Emma Jennings, Jeffrey Parsons and Z Montero. I'm going to allow the speakers to introduce themselves. So Emma, if you would like to lead us, that'd be great.
Thank you, Gemma. So my name is Emma Jennings, as Gemma said, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Lead at the Employers Network for Equality and Inclusion, or also known as ENEI for short. So I'm experienced in supporting a number of organisations on their inclusive practices. I previously led change management and inclusive culture change projects. And at ENEI, I provide guidance and consultancy on equality, diversity and inclusion. In my previous line of work, I've got a number of experience working with organisations on LGBT inclusion initiatives, facilitating a number of workshops, inclusive staff networks and intersectionality. So I'm really pleased to be joining you today, and hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on some really important topics. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, very much so. Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff, Jeffrey formally, but I prefer Jeff. And a bit about myself. And if you'd asked me this question just about a month ago, I was still at that point a managing director at Macquarie Group, which for those of you who don't know is an Australian outfit, which is partly a bank but doesn't have a retail presence in the UK. So people may not know it if they're not familiar with the things that it does. But what it's particularly famous for in this particular space, which I'm very proud of, is recently having come top of the Stonewall Workplace Equality rankings this year. And with that as a sort of mic drop moment, I decided I would move on from Macquarie and set up on a consultation of business on my own. So I'm now CEO and founder of a business called the Inclusion Imperative, which is entirely designed to do the sort of thing I'm doing today, to help organizations to learn around this space and to get better at being on a fully comprehensive inclusion journey. So, you'll hear a lot more about me from things like that. Just a bit more. I mean, obviously, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm sure some of you will have seen me around. I was chairing the network at Macquarie for 8 years. Before that, I co-founded the equivalent network at BNP Paribas. During that time, I've won a few awards, including a British LGBT Award for Inspirational Leader. And I'm looking forward to sharing the discussion today.
Thanks, Jeff. Z, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Z, pronounced they, she. So I am the founder of Aligned Purpose. That is pretty much an organization that supports individuals and businesses that purposely align themselves with inclusive practices and equitable future, and specifically focusing on intersectionality and new perspectives. And besides that, I am a writer, I'm a poet, and I write specifically to challenge the reader to reflect and engage on topics related to race, neurodiversity as well, and queerness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And last by utterly no means least, Ed, would you like to introduce yourself?
So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Ed. I guess I'm here as the a gay owner of small businesses, and I am previously a trustee of the LGBT Foundation, and I'm a member of the LGBT Directors and Leaders Network as well. So I'm coming at this from more the perspective of somebody who is too small to have a HR department or a group of diversity people working in this space. So it's just about creating an environment for LGBTQI plus employees to feel comfortable in order to kind of try and avoid the issues of harassment and bullying in the first place.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. I'm going to go straight into into our first question, and I mentioned earlier that it's Trans Day of Inclusivity, and so I wanted to start off a question related to our trans colleagues. What trans inclusive policies or actions can you recommend organisations implement to protect and support trans employees? For example, at Culture Shift, we have a transitioning at work policy and try to make it as safe as possible, and psychologically safe as well as physically safe for people to be transitioning at work. Z, I'm going to come to you first to answer that question, if that's okay.
Yes, so I wrote a couple of things down just to ensure that I'm not forgetting anything. And great, because I actually wanted to start with creating a guide for transitioning at work. So it shows that you're definitely on the right track. I think when it comes to creating a policy, it is very important to find out and to state where you stand as a company and what your commitments are. I think those are the two very important points to start with. Often what I've seen is that people include trans inclusive policy into their existing policy that they have already. I always try to say create a separate one, because there's a lot of different distinctions there. And trans individuals, of course, need to be supported in that process as well. So when you're thinking about your trans inclusive policy, of course, it's very important to remain gender neutral and using gender neutral language. Point to the Equality Act of 2010, the Gender Recognition Act of 2024, then diving into, harassment policy, dress codes, facilitations, and data and confidentiality is very important as well. Again, the transition at work guide of like how you're specifically supporting a person. And also if you can offer a care plan, which is also very important. If you offer employee assistance program, diversity monitoring, how do you deal with that? And having a glossary, just simply having a glossary of what defines trans. It is an umbrella term. So what do we mean specifically with that? And a very important one, and I do have a quick example that I want to give, is on sick leave and gender affirming surgery, right? So I want to give an example really quickly on why I do think that there should be two policies, having a specific trans inclusive policy. I was speaking to a person who was going to take a gender affirming surgery, and that was 10 years ago. They did not know, at that time there was no trans inclusive policy there, but he did look at the sick leave policy and he was like, well, that's great. That was during the interview process. He got the job, and a year into it, he took his sick leave in order to have his gender affirming surgery done. And all went fine, although unfortunately he had a manager that was probing a little bit, because he didn't say to his manager why he was going to take the sick leave, right? So there was only a policy, it was for everyone, but it was not specific. And when I asked him the question, if there was a trans inclusive gender affirming surgery and a care plan, would you have taken that? And of course, without a doubt, he said yes, because it makes it so much easier for him to actually already apply for it, knowing that the company already has that. And also just be already open, right? It is a policy that actually does the work for him. He just says, this is what I need. And that I think is very important and often something that people forget. And then also diving into a parental leave, specifically when you are doing adoption or when you are adopting, or if you are a person who is delivering a baby. Let's just say an example, a trans man, of course, their gender is man, but they might still have they might still have uterus. How do you go about that overview? Like, there's a whole specific individual process that individual has to take if they would like to deliver a child. So it is very important to have that trans inclusive policy there, because every individual is very different, and it is very important to be aware of that specific trans individual need. But yeah, so that is kind of like a quick overview. I hope I said it really quickly, but those are the things that you can definitely think about when creating a trans policy, a trans inclusive policy.
Thank you, thank you. Ed, do you want to add to that at all?
I think Z's covered most of it, if I'm honest. We don't have a separate trans policy at the moment, but what we have done is to do some of the de-biasing in the policies that we have, looking at using gender neutral languages. Again, when we talk about parental leave, we use language as in the birth parent and the other parent, that kind of stuff, so that it's a bit more gender neutral. And also as well, we do that for the sake not just of any trans employees, but for our wider kind of genderqueer employees as well. So that's one of the main things that we've done. And I think Z's points about things like glossaries are really important, because I think one of the basic things that employers and HR departments need to understand is that the issues faced by employees that they might not be aware of, and how we include employees in the kind of decision-making process when it comes to those policies. So we tend to have groups around the business, such as a leadership team, or we have a women's leadership group as well. So as many people as possible can contribute to our writing of our policies and to the approval of our policies, so that they can be as kind of as all inclusive as we probably can. So I think that's the main things that we've done so far.
Yeah, I think that's that's a lot, considering you're the owner of a small business. That's a lot of work that's been done there. Jeff, do you have anything to sort of build on or add to that at all?
It's been very comprehensive, particularly I think Z, you covered an awful lot there, but I do think it's worth just stepping back one step actually before we even start thinking about policies and guides, and just to actually say, like, you mentioned, Z, in particular, the levels of commitments that the organization must expressly have. Start by saying, are we going to be trans inclusive? And if so, our top line policy, which is a one-liner, is we are going to be a fully trans inclusive organization, and everything else cascades from that, and that will permeate through an awful lot of separate policies. It's important to have a trans policy, but it's going to really, as Ed was just saying, feed into an awful lot of other things as well. That has to happen. I've done quite a bit of organizational coaching and mentoring over the years, and I remember a few years ago, a fairly large bank came to talk to us at Macquarie and really kind of pick our brains, and they said, well, it basically said, why would we ever have a trans policy? We haven't got any trans staff. I mean, after I picked myself off the floor, I said, well, first of all, how do you know you don't have any trans staff? And they very probably don't, because with an attitude like that, if I were trans, I certainly wouldn't join you. And if you do have trans staff, they're not going to come out. And therefore you're losing an awful lot of potential staff value. So the point there is, basically make sure you're very clear about what your commitment is, and make that known to people that, you shouldn't be waiting. Don't wait for somebody to come to you and say, by the way, I'm trans, I want to come out, what do I do? That stuff should be there so that people know exactly what they're going to be doing. And from a practical perspective, there are lots of different people who need to know this stuff. And it's not obvious. It's not easy for the average staff member. They're going to need training. They're going to need a lot of coaching. And really the organization needs to give them the tools to do that. So, practical guides that you can give to staff, not only the staff member transitioning, but their colleagues and their managers about how they should be working with them and helping them on that journey, as well as HR and senior management, etc. All of those things can be done. I mean, at Macquarie had 3 or 4 separate guides specifically tailored towards different people within the organization. An obvious protest will be, look, we just don't have the resources. We don't know this stuff. I get that, but there are plenty of people who you can go to who will help externally. There are tons of really, really willing resources, people out there who want to make sure that organizations are trans inclusive and will give of their time to give advice. So, you can go to Global Butterflies, Trans in the City, Mermaids, Gendered Intelligence. I could rattle off a whole bunch more. And most of them will give their time because they're very, very keen to make sure that the world is as trans inclusive as we would like it to be. But in the meantime, small wins. Make sure you've got your pronouns up there on as I've got here, and make sure you've got them on your systems. Make sure you do let people know about your key, the basics of language. Don't necessarily say ladies and gentlemen if it's going to be a problem. And that would be exclusive, certainly non-binary folk, and it may be potentially challenging for people who are transitioning. Just say everyone. Hi, everyone. You didn't say hi, ladies and gentlemen. Think about safe spaces, think about gender neutral facilities, but get the basics right at the start. Get your commitment level sorted out. Get your short-term wins. Make sure the signaling is very clear about the direction you're going in, and then use other people to help you build critical mass and momentum from that.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Thank you, everyone, for that. I'm going to take it slightly broader now. And I'm going to come to you first, Emma, if that's okay. If you have, how have you implemented training sessions and workshops on LGBTQ+ issues within the workplace? If you have there been any negative responses or pushbacks? And if so, how did you deal with those? And how would you advise others to be able to deal with those things?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done many of them in the past. And I'm going to use an example actually from way back when I did one of my first ones, and it was a really challenging one. And it was to a very male-dominated industry, and I say that because it's relevant. I delivered a LGBT foundation training piece to a number of senior leaders, and I think the reason I'm saying it's a male-dominated industry, classically kind of white male cis het, and there was a lot of, you expect from a training session, a lot of growth questions. How can we implement initiatives, when can we intervene, that sort of thing. But when you have the questions of the why, so why should we be intervening, why should we be doing that, then you're in for a treat. So within that session, I learned very quickly that they hadn't been prepared in terms of why they were there in the first place and what they were expecting. So I think the first thing to take away is to know your demographic, know if they've been, prepared and to why they're there, because a lot of the time those audiences that aren't, and they've been kind of pushed there by HR or EDI because they need to, there needs to be some sort of good communication beforehand to make sure that they're on the same page as to why they're there. And that comes from, the CEO, the senior leadership, but also HR and EDI leads as well. And many, many years later, I went back to that organisation and delivered something very similar. And what I did do is go back to them with a number of statistics up my sleeve, but also bringing it back to the business case and a lot of the benefits that go alongside, inclusion and why you're delivering that. By that point, there was a little bit more understanding, but kind of bringing it back to the business case of why it affects their organisation, how it benefits them to be LGBT inclusive, and understanding the real needs and understanding the statistics specific to their sector as well. So, you know, if you are from a youth charity, use the youth statistics that are out there. Go to places like Stonewall or Mermaids that have those research and reports that are readily available for the workplace. And kind of using lived experience is something that I've done in the past, but also if I'm never going to speak for a trans individual because I'm not trans, and I can talk about some of the top tips to be allies and allyship, but actually if you're talking and training about trans inclusion, you should be having those voices there in the room. So it's about bringing lived experience, bringing the benefits, and trying to know your audience and demographic.
Yeah, and I think that prep work and that foundation work is really important. So you're not necessarily getting that resistance in the room, because that feels like it's not a good productive use of anyone's time then, does it? And I think I often feel disheartened a little bit in having to talk about the business case and why it makes like business sense, because what I want people to feel is that they want to do it because it's the right thing to do, and morally as a business it's the right thing to do, but unfortunately we do have to arm ourselves either with the business case or with the statistics just to really argue the case, but I hope for a time when we don't have to do that, definitely. Jeff, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me use the time I spent at Macquarie. I was there for nearly 9 years, and we did an awful lot of training in that regard. And I think it's worth just thinking about, you know, the different types of training and how you can go about that. I think there are actually two different types of training. There's very much a sort of formalistic HR-based training, which is, you know, rolled out. I mean, at Macquarie it was called appropriate workplace behavior, which is really covering an awful lot of things, and it included a lot of stuff around inclusion of people with minority characteristics, including LGBTQ+, and would have live examples about that. But it was rolled out by compliance, or it wasn't by compliance, it was actually from HR, but it had a very compliance-y feel to it. And as a result, it was mandatory for everyone, but everyone treated it as a mandatory thing I have to do. Rather, they didn't really engage with it. It was something that, you know, you really have to do. And as the chair of the network, I was aware of that. And, you know, people who were interested in this stuff would go along and learn, but other people would just go through the motions. So the other type of training is really the stuff that people like the staff networks can do. Just, you know, procure training at a much more sort of engaging, functional way where you haven't got to be quite so formalistic. Give live examples, and, you know, get really relevant speakers in the room who you know, people can relate to and really quiz. And so there's a couple of ways you can approach that. The trouble is, you're looking at those two types of training. If it's mandatory training, as I said, you've got a compliance mindset. People are at the best, they're going to go through the motions. Quite often you get a bit of a resentful attitude. You're wasting my time. I could be making money. Why are you making me do this? I've had reactions in the room like, you know, well, you know, why is there no white straight men's network? You know, of course, you know, that sort of thing, which is, you know, aren't we just here to learn how not to get sued? That sort of thing is, you have to engage, you know, you have to get past that and engage with the people. And the trouble with the other type of training, of course, the stuff coming from people like the network and stuff, is it's a little bit self-selecting. It's not mandatory. So anyone who's not interested or not particularly sympathetic just won't come. So you have to find ways to get over that. The latter, I always found, I use my favorite phrase, the old Trojan horse strategy of getting them in the room with something else. You know, you get a speaker that you think they might be interested in to listen. We had, you know, get Gareth Thomas to come talk about rugby or something, and then, by the way, when he's in the room, you know, when they're in the room, you can hit them over the head with the message that you really want. That sort of thing is very good. But most importantly, it's really about engagement. The whole thing is, you know, when you've got people who are, you know, you're struggling to connect with, remember that we talk an awful lot about psychological safety in the workplace from the perspective of people like myself who are LGBTQ and want to make sure that we feel psychologically safe. We have to remember that other staff need to feel that as well. We want to engage them. We don't want to basically make them feel like we are policing them so much that they will not engage. No one ever changed their mind after being called a bigot. Nothing over the last few years, you know, the last 5 years or so in this country, we've had so many polarized debates, political, etc. It should be fairly clear that people slinging mud and arrows at each other doesn't create consensus. All it does is create division. We need to find ways not to do that. So don't go around throwing terms like hate crime in the workplace if we mean microaggression. Don't make it sound like it's so, so dramatic. Find ways to talk to people. Use what I call the ABC concept: agree before challenging. Find something that they've said that you can pick on, and then move to an adjacency of that to try and move them progressively. Don't try to expect to tell people, look, no, you're wrong. This is what you should be doing. People will just close down. So bear that in mind whenever you're doing training. It's not a lecture. It's not trying to tell people just in a way which makes them tick the box. It's trying to get them to understand the why, and to win over hearts and minds, basically. Otherwise, all they'll ever do at the very best is go through the motions, and that's worse than useless.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Z, I know that you've facilitated as well as probably partaken in lots of training sessions. Have you got anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think what the other one said is pretty much also what I want to say. And I do think I do want to put in the elements specifically when it comes to facilitation. I have also had experiences. I think it is important to do the pre-work. Like Emma said, find out what the culture is. It doesn't mean that you have to change it straight away, but just simply find out what the culture is through communications, through using the intranet, to make a statement of where the company stands. I think that is very important, because with the facilitator, if you're going to go for an external facilitator, you will get them, actually, they will understand a little bit more where the company is as well, right? And you work together with them. So in one instance, I worked with an HR team, and they found out that there was some trans exclusionary behavior. They did not have any problems with sexuality, but when we spoke about gender, that is where it was a bit more difficult, right? So there was some trans exclusionary behavior. Now together, I changed and added some things to my facilitation session that could support that type of behavior and really diving into it. So it is for the facilitator way much more helpful to know where the company stands and how you can support them, and that is kind of like what you want. And often, and also, so I think a very important thing, make a distinction between sex and gender. If you're going to go for trans inclusionary behavior, you have to really dive into it and state that you are LGBT and trans inclusion, because there is, when we're talking about sexuality, that is behind closed doors. Yes, there is certain behaviors, but when we're talking about gender, we are diving into their personal, it becomes personal, right? So for some people who are trans exclusionary, maybe just unconscious biases, they are not aware that their language might be trans exclusionary. Also, it feels, when we're talking about gender, we're talking about personal identity, we're talking about themselves, and we're talking about behavior, and that behavior influences the culture of the organization. So you really have to, when I'm really trying to hone in on gender, make sure that there's a distinction there. And the reason for that is you want to make the facilitator and of course HR want to make it as safe as a team, safe as a session for the people in the training session, right? So there has been situations where inappropriate questions were asked, and there was a trans individual there. There were people from the LGBT community there. So also thinking about what kind of impact does it have for the people who are part of the training session, and what does, so making sure that the pre-work is there, having an understanding, and then working together with the facilitator. And I also really want to have at the end, double checking with everybody's mental health, emotional health, even if it was a great facilitation session, but just making sure, because everything can be triggering, right? You never really know. So just double checking towards the end, how did everybody find it? If you have an LGBT staff network group, making sure that there's a communication there, that people can just have a debrief. How was it? What do they want? And that's how you continue to have that conversation within the organization.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to understand that in the moment after that training session, it might be fine, but you don't know how it's going to affect, later on. And so I think it's really important to kind of space that checking in out. So immediately kind of check in sort of at the end, but then also once people have kind of sat with it for a bit, also check in a few days later to kind of continue the conversation, because you don't know, you can't really tell what's going to
Exactly.
when you're going to feel the feelings, are you, and
Exactly.
have the questions. So I think that's really, really important as
Yeah,
well.
and it's a marathon, of course, right? So for some people, it's very, very, very new, especially when it comes to inclusive language. It's going to take a long time for everyone to learn how to be inclusive in their language. So I had a person who understood that they were trans inclusive, but their language was trans exclusive. So how do you do that? Now, in the training session, perfect. I know exactly what I can do to answer your questions, right? But that is the pre-work that the HR team and the DI team did perfectly, so that they knew that their language was not gender inclusive, right? So that is where I can really dive in, and those are the most effective facilitation sessions that I've had, and it has had a positive outcome.
Definitely. And I think this is what separates organizations from those who are box ticking to, like, you know, we need to do some LGBTQ plus training, to those who are actually committing to the work, and that kind of thing, that like engaging with the facilitator to just flag those things that they know could potentially come up is so important, so that the facilitator isn't completely blindsided within in the session, and can is prepared to be able to have to tackle those difficult conversations. I'm going to move on to staff networks, which have been mentioned over the past couple of questions in a couple of different ways. I don't know whether it's in the run up to this session or not, but the conversation around the importance of staff networks seems to be happening more and more. I don't know whether everyone else has noticed that, but I definitely have, particularly in the last couple of months. And I've seen staff networks that are really amazing, and have the opportunity to feed in, inform, feedback when things are done and are really part of the conversation. And I've seen staff networks that feel like they're there to tick a box, but don't feel like they're included in the discussion, and feel like stuff is being implemented upon them, rather than being part of the whole conversation and the whole reason that they're there. So have you worked at places that have had LGBTQ plus staff networks, and if so, how successful were they, and would you suggest people go about starting them if they don't have those networks? And I'm going to come to you first, Ed, if that's okay, because even though you're part of a relatively small organization, in your first answer you kind of gave a couple of examples of maybe the start of networks, if you're not necessarily officially calling them networks. And I think that's really interesting, that you don't have to be like a huge global organization to have a staff network. So could you talk to us a little bit about your experience there, please?
So yeah, we started out by having a women's leadership group, and we've had one for a while now. And the intention is that now that we understand how that network works and how it's involved, how it speaks to and hears from senior leadership, to branch them out into other areas, other kinds of staff networks. But again, being small, the issue that we have is that obviously we have more women than we have LGBTQI staff. So when you're talking about smaller numbers, it becomes a little bit trickier to have those kind of staff networks. So we've relied up to now on issues of intersectionality coming up at places like the Women's Leadership Group. So it's because it's not just a group for women, it provides the opportunity for people to talk about these issues that cut across different groups as well. So that's one of the ways that we've done it. And as I mentioned previously, the Women's Leadership Group has been involved in kind of reviewing policies that we have, like harassment policy, in order that we can make sure that they are more inclusive than the kind of policies that we get from our HR support companies, which tend to be more kind of legally tick boxing. So one of the things that we try to do is have more enlightened HR policies so they are more inclusive from the start. And that's one way that our staff network at the moment as it happens. But yeah, we have thrown the invitation out and to say we want to support more staff networks. But again, I think the issue that we have at the moment is getting a kind of is getting the velocity, just getting enough people to say they're interested and to, you know, to put something together. So yeah, that's the challenge, I think, with being small.
Yeah, but I think, you know, the conversation's being had, which is really, really important, isn't it? Emma, have you got anything to add to the power of staff networks?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can, do it.
Yeah.
It's I mean, as you say, Ed, as a small organisation, there is a challenge there. Obviously, you might not have the staff that identify within that protected characteristic, whether that's race, whether that's LGBT, whether that's across the board. But what I've been having increasing conversations about, and it's interesting that you talk about intersectionality, is actually having, you know, an EDI steering group, even having, you know, a few people that can be EDI champions and can, you know, champion LGBT from that perspective is one way of going about it. If you are obviously in a slightly larger organisation, having an LGBT network group can foster support. It can allow a space for safe conversations. It can allow LGBTQ plus employees to have a place where they can talk about lived experiences, potentially be able to feed back to the organisation and be able to inform some of the organisational training and also policies. Like we talk about the trans policy at work, they could review that as part of their activity. And just having that opportunity to be able to feed back to the wider organisation and share that is paramount, I think, in terms of changing culture. What I see more often than not in the line of work that I'm in is network groups starting and having a lot of enthusiasm, and one or two people that lead the network group as network chairs. 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, the momentum starts to die and the enthusiasm starts to wane. And that more often than not is based on support and what the organisation is giving them in terms of support, not only from senior leadership, but also from in terms of their workload as well. What we see is burnout a lot with network chairs. And so I would say for HR leads and EDI leads that are hoping to kind of put that out there as an opportunity for the beginnings of an LGBT network, is to think ahead and to think about how might their work be impacted, but also how might that work benefit the organisation, and actually spending time allocating that time to that network group as part of their performance appraisal, as part of their workload during the week is one way of really doing that, and having that senior sponsorship as well. Yeah,
definitely. The bit that you mentioned there about burnout really, really resonates. So I think that's a really important thing to identify and be aware of, so that you can put that support in place. Definitely. Z, have you got anything to add to that?
I think everything was already mentioned. Definitely the appraisals. I think that is so important to, you know, really think about what more skills a person can learn as being part of the LGBT staff network. But actually, to go back all the way to the beginning, the why is so important. We know it's for the LGBT community, but also, you know, thinking about how you're going to set up, because there are a lot of different elements that you can think about, right? Is thinking about, you know, do you want to specifically only create a safe space, i.e., you know, bringing people together? Is it going to be a confidential space? You have to make sure that that is very clear. Is it going to be a safe space? Are people going to go there for any issues that they might have? Or is it a place where they're going to be celebrated? Is it going to be a mix and match of all these different things? And also a very important one is, are allies included or not, right? So there's a lot of, I think that's a combination of is the best. But there are allies who, of course, really want to make sure that their LGBT colleagues are supported in any way. But it can take away from the safe space if a person who is of the LGBT community wants to be involved. So often what is mainly recommended is to have, for example, in a month, if you're meeting twice a month, having one session or one day where it's only LGBT and the other day where allies are included, because allies are very, very important. And specifically when it comes to skills, if, for example, an ally wants to be involved and their communication skills are amazing, they can give their time to creating the weekly newsletter. When it comes to Pride, and they're amazing with project management, yes, we would love to have somebody involved there. So we're really trying to make sure that the skills are there. And of course, when it comes to anything confidential, that is where, you know, you want to make sure that it's a safe space for the LGBT people as well. I do also want to state the intersectionality here, because of course, a lot of people have different experiences. You know, my experience is totally different from a person who might be white and is part of the LGBT community. So really trying to make sure that all voices are heard, and trying to figure out how these voices will be heard, and which organizations actually you know, have already done the work in showing, you know, that they have amazing staff network group. Often staff network groups from other companies, you know, get in contact with them because they would love to share what they did well and what went really wrong, right? They actually really would like to share their knowledge. So definitely get in contact with other organizations specifically to your sector or industry, and have a chat with them on how they actually started, what went wrong, and what went right in their the creation of creating their network group.
I think, you know, you mentioning about what went wrong, I wish people would feel brave enough to share that more. I went to an EDI conference the other day, and it was literally just, you know, everyone was absolutely nailing EDI like really well, like loads of case studies just about how fantastic they were, and that's great. But I think the learning lies in what went wrong and then what you did to address that and rectify it. So I wish people would be a bit more, you know, courageous and highlight when things went wrong, because we're all learning, and like you say, it's a marathon, isn't it?
And yeah, exactly.
You know,
and we're individuals. We're all having our separate lives. Everybody, there's so many intersectionality to one individual. Of course, you're not going to get it right the first time. So that is totally okay. But as long as your goal is there to make it comfortable and safe workplace for LGBT employees, then that is something that you need to focus on and continue to focus on.
Definitely. Jeff, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to staff networks at all.
Yeah, I do, and I'm going to have to try and keep myself short here, because this is really kind of my wheelhouse. I mean, I co-founded the network at BNP Paribas before I left, and I chaired the network at Macquarie for 8 years. And it's really you know, the one at Macquarie in particular is seen as a bit of a powerhouse network in the market. So yeah, I've got a lot to say on this, but I mean, happily coming up to this last, pretty much everything has been covered. And it's very interesting to hear the different perspectives. I would just say, I mean, obviously at this point, to try to be practical, once you've established obviously why the network is there, and you know, that isn't always as obvious as people would think, and it is important to have consensus. I think in the LGBTQ plus space, there is probably a high degree of consensus, but I remember having interesting conversations in a couple of organizations about with members of the gender network, particularly mainly the women's network, and there was absolutely no consensus as to what those networks were for. They had very different views around what, you know, staff were expecting of those networks. So it is important to have, you know, a central mission which people buy into, however much they sort of, you know, move around the gray areas around the edge of that. You know, make sure you know what it's there for. And you know, to the point that's already been made, I mean, once you know you're going to have a network, what you're really looking to the organization to do is to facilitate that, to put in place the plumbing so that it can happen, and the support. It should not be mandated in a way which sounds like it's a tick boxy thing, or we're doing this and it must be done. You really want to be motivating staff to do this, which, you know, is, you know, maybe a bit utopian in some organizations, particularly smaller ones, but, you know, this is not the sort of thing which people will do, you know, anything other than, you know, to the bare minimum if they think that it's just you know, a box ticking exercise. You really want to motivate people to do something for positive change, and that includes, as has been said, like, you know, trying to give feedback into how the organization can learn and develop, and the policies and practices can actually be improved. So, you know, give the staff the infrastructure, but don't impose too many things on them. And as we've said, don't expect this to be done entirely side of desk. I mean, it may be primarily side of desk, but it's something that should be taken into account in people's performance appraisals and their remuneration, because it is adding brand value and an awful lot of other soft value for the organization. And make sure that the people have a good incentive to stay involved, and that can be as basic as making it fun. It's actually meant to be fun, right? You can get networks which are designed entirely to be fun. It really isn't much more than a bunch of people going down the pub. That's great for that, but it won't obviously create much organizational learning. But even if you are devoting yourself to being a real learning tool and a pressure point for positive change, you can still make it fun. You can still have events and stuff which are celebratory, and have a ping pong tournament, have a drag night, whatever it is. Just make sure that people are aware that it's not all just heavy stuff. We're not just lecturing at them the whole time. There are things that they can do to come along and have a bit of fun and engage in it and learn a bit along the way. And the last point really is one that was Zia just made, is don't be an island. I mean, particularly the small organizations like Ed, you're saying, very few organizations have enough critical mass to start out having lots of lovely dedicated networks. You're going to have to borrow. And there are plenty of other cross-industry organizations out there that you can join in. There are plenty of other organizations, as has been said, that have been through this journey and will share. I mean, I've done that, given back an awful lot to other organizations, because when I was setting out on this journey, particularly when I was really getting into some real meat of the requirements at Macquarie, I called in just about every favor I could from people on the street, out on the networks in the street to help me on that. And it's only fair, give back. I mean, a rising tide lifts all boats, and most people have that view within this space. So, it's an absolutely essential thing to have, I think, but they are very, very different networks. I mean, they're not all much of a muchness, and, reach out and other people help you on that journey.
Can I just ask you about something that you said a little bit at the beginning of your answer there about, deciding like what the network is going to be and what its purpose is. Is that for the group to decide and communicate to the organization, or is that for the organization to say, it would be great if you could think about some of these things, like how we could do some of these things? Like which way should it be?
Ideally, it should be staff driven, in as much as, really this is a reverse mentoring program at organizational level, if you like. I mean, so the people who are best placed to really lead on this are not necessarily executive management, but you want executive management to be, leaning into that conversation and saying, how can I work with you? How can I facilitate this? What can I do? So, if it is just, senior management saying, we would like to be seen to be LGBTQ plus inclusive, so we can say in our annual report, that message is going to get across very, very clearly to the people who are really going to be at the coalface trying to put this in place. And it won't happen. That's where burnout happens. Where you avoid burnout is where you actually do motivate people and incentivize people and give them the space to actually contribute value into the organization. So it really should come from the staff to the extent it can. What you ask the organization and the executive management to do is to facilitate with realistic expectations and good infrastructure that will support them, including things like policies and budgets and time, and evaluations of their performances, etc.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I can't believe how quickly this has gone. We've actually only got 10 minutes left now. And if anyone listening has got any questions, please, for our panelists, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the Zoom panel. Whilst people have a little think about if there's anything they want to ask, I'm going to come to the discussion about intersectionality, which has been raised a few times throughout this hour. And obviously, intersectionality is a really important strand of diversity and inclusion because it affects everyone. And we all have different aspects of ourselves that form our identity. And each part of that identity can have lived experiences of discrimination, which can then differ to someone else who may share the same aspects. How can and should intersectionality be incorporated into policies to make sure that everyone feels included and free from discrimination? And I'm going to come to Ed first.
I think I would probably refer back to what I spoke earlier about neutrality in language of policies, I think. But in terms of, I think staff networks are really important ways, I think, of ensuring that intersectionality is considered. They're the two things that we've done so far towards that, I think. And I think we can always do more. But yeah, sorry, it's a very, very short answer for me on that one.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Emma, would you like to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of building on what we've talked about in terms of policy and practice, being able to understand the kind of, for example, you're a deaf employee and you want to join an LGBT network, but there isn't a facility. It's looking at all those little things that actually, you know, when you were looking at your diversity and inclusion calendar of events throughout the year, are you looking at just one strand? Are you just looking at particular awareness months and awareness days? Or, for example, Mental Health Awareness Week, can you not talk about LGBT mental health? Can you talk about some of the statistics around that? The fact that, you know, LGBT people are twice as likely almost to have a mental health condition, and just raising that awareness throughout some of those awareness days dotted around the year. I mean, in terms of policy, I would just try and be as inclusive as possible within all of your policies anyway. But in terms of the practice, and activities for engagement. For example, if you've got a network group that's on a particular time, on a particular day, on a particular month, but it clashes, you know, let's say an LGBT network clashes within a religion and faith network. Well, that person that is LGBT and a faith, which one do they go to? It's just looking at things like that in the bigger picture and being able to be aware of that and making sure that staff are aware that there are options.
Definitely. Jeff, have you got anything to add to that?
Make sure I'm not on mute. Yeah, actually, Emma's just nailed exactly what I was thinking, which is actually in a way, I think this discussion almost doesn't belong in policy, because the policy issue is really just, you know, the bare bones of making sure that you've got, you know, a properly inclusive, you know, language, etc., in all of your policies. What it really comes down to is the practice and the procedures. Which is, again, largely going to be driven by, you know, practical things that people like the employee networks can do. But this is where you need some sort of oversight, you know, ideally from a DE&I infrastructure, where somebody can say, look, actually, you know, you in the Pride network are planning to do something, but, you know, are you aware that either that clashes with something maybe the gender network is doing, or somebody in the ethnicity network, you know, wouldn't be able to do this because of that, etc., etc. You need someone to basically try to sort of, you know, give a little bit of intelligence, which stops people just thinking within the very narrow confines of their particular brief. But in any case, I mean, you know, this is a way that you can, you know, I mentioned earlier the value of networks and how to make it fun and make it interesting. You know, the sort of things that, you know, you want people to be actually thinking about actually are typically intersectional anyway. I mean, you know, very few things can just sit within one box. I mean, no one's just one thing, right? So it's actually much more interesting if you can bring more people into the conversation and have you know, different perspectives which allow the conversation to flow, and actually everybody can learn something about it. It can feel like, if you're, for example, in the LGBT network, you feel like the mission is to educate the world about LGBT, but it is a two-way street. You know, there are plenty of other things that the LGBTQ+ network can learn from other people who are potentially not LGBT, but may well be, but will have an intersection. You know, it's important to always keep that example, you know, this principle in mind. I always think, you know, intersectionality is only, you know, a phrase that's has only been around for 30 years or so, but 50 years ago, you know, there was this very famous civil rights movement. It was actually a society of Black lesbian activists in Boston, who were, at the time, they were up in arms about the fact that, that the civil rights movement wasn't answering what they needed to. Neither was the women's lib, if you like. It wasn't, basically they're saying, look, we are not being addressed. You're missing half of all of who we are. We're not just women, we're not just Black. We are a bunch of other stuff as well. We need a comprehensive oversight about all the things that we are. And if we start taking that perspective, you shouldn't even need individual networks. The ultimate point will be you have a DEI network, if you like, where everyone can operate much more fluidly across what otherwise become compounding barriers to inclusion. So ultimately try to find ways to work across horizontally as well as vertically within your silos, and you'll be much more successful.
Yeah, and in the chat, Mabinti has said, I think it's about staff networks collaborating and co-creating events and policies and processes to ensure that intersectionality is considered. And I think, that was that underlines the point that you were making there, Jeff.
Okay.
I'm going to come to my last question, because I don't think that the audience has any questions, which is about allyship. And I'd really like you to kind of talk about how we encourage LGBTQ plus allyship. And I'm going to come to you, Z, first.
Yes. So when it comes to LGBT allyship, I think the most important thing is just start again at the basics. Start with language and terminology, as that is such a societal thing, and it's a lot of unpacking and unlearning of the language and the terminologies, or the language specifically, as in making it inclusive. Also, really learn about activism. I think that is also such a vital thing, because often along the lines of human rights activism, there were trans individuals involved, there were non-binary individuals involved, there were LGBT individuals involved. You just never heard of them. And that is such a vital thing about activism. And I think an amazing documentary for people who are interested is a person called Polly Murray. Polly Murray has been very vital in the Women's Equality Act that Ruth Ginsburg spoke about. And this person was non-binary. And this was back in, 30, 40 years back. And I think it's very important that people know about these individuals, right? It was a mixed race individuals, born, assumed, a woman, true life, dealt with so many difficult things. And yet they were able to create and write something that was so vital to the women equality movement. And not a lot of people know about them, right? So it's so important to learn about the history of the people about activism. Also, again, like I said, understanding the intersectionalities. One's experience is not the same as the other. Intersectionality is very important there as well. And the last one is also don't make assumptions. This goes back to, if you learn about the terminology and language, don't make assumptions about somebody's gender identity or sexuality. And if you do, just apologize, move on. Don't stay too long there. Just don't over apologize. Don't get into your head. I think those are the kind of like the very important things to start with regarding allyship.
Thank you. Emma, did you want to add anything to that at all?
Just quickly, I suppose, if you've got, if you are a senior leader, or you are HR or an EDI manager, I think just using your sphere of influence to be able to push training, push these, these campaigns forward, and utilize your privilege and power to be able to have these discussions and push it forward. Step up as an ally by listening and learning from your workforce, but not asking them directly what they should know. It's more about, doing the education piece yourself, giving employees the tools and the resources to be able to do that. And E&EI have an amazing amount of resources on allyship, on intersectionality. So, do your research as much as possible, and yeah, listen.
Yeah, definitely. I have got a question from the audience, which I think I'll be really interested in your answers for this. Something I'm really passionate about advocating for is the proper remuneration of staff members who are helping organisations to grow and develop by contributing to their DEI strategies. Ultimately, colleagues are being asked to invest a lot of time, energy and emotional labour into maintaining and engaging in staff networks. What forms of remuneration do you believe organisations should be considering, particularly smaller companies who can't necessarily provide financial incentives? And they go on to say, I think personal and professional development is a great option, but only where it's something that the individual feels is going to be of benefit to them in the future. Is there anything else that you'd recommend? I'm talking specifically about employees who are driving these networks forward, taking on an additional workload, not all employees that engage and use those safe spaces. Has anyone got any examples of good remuneration or recognition for those colleagues driving those things?
I can chime in here very briefly because I know we're short on time.
Yeah.
At Macquarie, where I was before, I mean, it's to the stage now where it's absolutely a prerequisite. It's a standard in performance appraisals, which sounds a bit formalistic, but to be up for anything other than a sort of cursory bonus, and certainly for any promotion, staff are actually expected to demonstrate that they have done something, or that they, are doing something in the DE&I space. So it is actually kind of effectively sanctioned. And the quid pro quo for that is, if you are doing that, then that is positively seen in terms of all of those things, in terms of promotion, in terms of remuneration. Now, admittedly, Macquarie may be sort of, fairly advanced relative to other organizations in that, but there are plenty of other options that people can do. And the other thing to bear in mind is actually, if done right, this actually is a win-win, right? I mean, although there's an awful lot of work goes in, it's not only is it fun, but it's also terrific for your profile. I was better known at Macquarie for being the chair of the Pride Network than I ever was for what I was paid to be doing, because it was actually creating much more brand value, if you like, and that was a filter. It got me into conversations with people that I ordinarily wouldn't have bumped into in my day job, and that face time is very useful for one's own profile and progression. So although it's obviously nice to get a check at the end of the day for what you've done, there are other ways of it benefiting you, and the organization can help. Of course, they can send you on professional development training courses, etc., and you can make sure you've got those external exposures, give you the time to go to networking events, that sort of stuff. If there is a real buy-in on both sides, there are plenty of ways that you can actually make this a sort of it's not a zero-sum game. You can get more out of it than just that.
Fab. Thank you so much. I am going to finish there because we are out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much to the listeners for joining us today, and thank you so much to our panelists, Ed Cox, Emma Jennings, Jeffrey Parsons, and Z Montero. Really, really appreciate that you joining us today and us giving your time. And I hope that everyone really enjoyed that discussion as much as I did.
Thank you so much for having us and having me as well. I really enjoyed it. I hope that people can definitely take the learnings out of this. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone in the panel as well.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have great days, everyone.
Everyone. Thank you.